Okay, so for this module, we're going to be looking at feature film. There's some crossover in some of the actors and the creatives in this space from our previous module on documentaries and short film. So you might recognise some of the names as we go through. Now, what we've done with the lecture slides is, where possible, we've given you a link to the film's trailer, but what you'll actually find is that a lot of the full films are available on Canopy through the University of Newcastle Library. You will need your student login to be able to access the full film, but the trailers are there just as a taster for you to get started. And it's probably will come as a surprise to many of you, just the amount of Aboriginal film that there is. Okay, so we're going to be looking in this module, particularly on how feature film has been used to show stereotypes and to try and address issues of marginality. Okay, and that's marginality in the industry as much as it is in broader Australian society. Okay, so Indigenous peoples have been portrayed in film since the silent era in the 1920s. And those films were generally made from a European viewpoint, and they were, really condescending in their view of Indigenous Australians. Okay. And so Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in these films are generally portrayed as primitive and inferior to white Australians. And so what we also see is that Indigenous Australians were often played by non-Indigenous people who were in, what's termed blackface. Okay, and so there wasn't really, any true representation of customs, traditions, and peoples. But this really contributed to stereotyping and to negative perceptions in the wider community. All right, so in 1955, Australia's first coloured film was made, and that was made by Charles Chauvel, and the story was called Jeddah, and it was about an Aboriginal girl, who, in the words of those times, was torn between civilization and returning to her traditions. So there were these very heavily ethnocentric overtones that Aboriginality, was something to be left behind for a better life in assimilation. And, I think that that's really problematic. And it also fitted that kind of European norm of the tragic end, where the heroine is killed. Okay. So had, a really big impact, though, on Australian popular culture. So we're just seeing some examples here of the different kinds of promotions that were circulating in the 1950s around its release. And you may have seen its star, Rosalie Kunoth-Monks, who is a contemporary, Aboriginal speaker, elder, and activist. Okay, so it premiered in January in 1955. But what's important to note is that at that time, the audience was segregated. So in the Northern Territory and in a lot of states, including New South Wales, picture theatres, often had separate seating for Aboriginal people, which was, of a lesser quality than that for non-Indigenous people. Okay, so, some of, when we look back, some of the ways that the film was promoted, are now just incredibly cringeworthy and racist. So just looking at the first one here, the magic of the native mating call was stronger than the habits of civilization. And so what we see is that the film, while, it was great because it had Aboriginal actors and it had an Aboriginal storyline. At the same time, it also was very much shaped by what was happening politically around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy in the 1950s. So Australia was still in the White Australia policy, although after World War II, some of that was starting to open up with migration. There's a really great article here on the making of Jeddah that would be worth your while having a read of. But we have to then think, it's only a really short period of time where we've gone from these really racist kind of cliches to having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in creative roles, doing the productions themselves or having the control to enter into partnerships with non-Indigenous filmmakers to make some really meaningful stories. So, although this isn't, a hard and fast rule, Indigenous filmmakers often cast Indigenous characters in the lead role and sell their stories and set their stories within an Indigenous community and cultural context. And so in doing so, some of that then has this political idea of changing people's perceptions of what life in Aboriginal communities was and is like. Okay, so if we look at the first hyperlink here, it's to Reconciliation Australia, and they have a whole list of Indigenous film titles. But we can also see that, other mediums like SBS, particularly in its on-demand section, promotes Indigenous film. So you can have a look at those as well. And we know that, as we look into the future of filmmaking, that there have been some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander trailblazers, and that the industry, while it's still not perfect, is in many ways opening up to be more inclusive. So there are specific opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander filmmakers, but we're also starting to see some of that move more into, what's termed the mainstream as well. So some of the things that you can do to try and, promote a greater understanding are suggested by groups like Reconciliation Australia. And so they have a site where they talk about using film and perhaps a film club as a way of promoting reconciliation, getting, some of the hard discussions going. These are not easy talks for us to have. Okay, so probably one of the Aboriginal people who has most consistently appeared across Aboriginal film is David Gulpilil, who is an actor and a member of the Order of Australia. And, he's been acting for a very long time, from being a young man in the original version of Storm Boy and still acting today. Okay, so a more recent film that he's done is Charlie's Country in 2014, which was directed by Rolf de Heer. And so, this is the kind of story that was done, created specifically around him, around him being that lead character. And it, has received multiple awards. So there's a series of links that you can go through to explore this further. Another film is the 2002 film The Tracker. And so it looked at an Aboriginal man who'd been accused of murder being tracked down. And while this is a fictional account, it is based on, some of the actual stories which occurred. It's also, linked to music through the Aboriginal songwriter Archie Roach. Okay, and, if we look at some of these stories, they really are incredibly artistic in the way that they present things like the landscape. Okay, so going right back to Jeddah, And then looking again at, this very orange landscape, the bright blue sky, there's this real highlighting of the landscape as a feature within the film itself. One of the things that we do see in films like The Tracker is that they are incredibly violent. And so, I'd probably give a little bit of a trigger warning to students before they watch some of these films, to understand that the context of particularly this colonial genre of film, when it represents, is quite violent. Okay, we can also see some other examples. So things like film comedy, in the film Stone Bros, and then also the film 10 Canoes, which, operates at multiple levels. So at some levels it's a drama, at other levels it, verges on documentary, and then there are some parts of it that are really very funny. Okay. We've also seen Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander filmmakers move into film musicals. So the 2012 film The Sapphires, made by Wayne Blair, is a particularly good example. And the 2010 film directed by Rachel Perkins, On Brand New Day, which was taken from the stage play of the same name, have all moved into, the public viewing. Okay, Toomelah is a community based on a mission located on the New South Wales-Queensland border. And Ivan Sen has made a dramatic film set there on a young boy. And you can watch the full film on Canopy. Rabbit Proof Fence is probably one of the better known Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander films. And it talks, I think very personally, but also then in a broader political sense, about the stolen generations. Okay, it's based on a book by Doris Pilkington Garamara, who was one of the girls taken away in the film. And then there's a whole range of other films like Satellite Boy, Yolngu Boy, Mystery Road. There's, I think, an enormous range of films by Aboriginal filmmakers that we often, don't think about. They certainly, they're not going to make it to our ordinary TV viewing. That tend to be more placed in kind of niche areas. So we talked last week about Bec Cole. So you were introduced to her. She also made a film called Here I Am in 2011, and she worked with Warwick Thornton, the Aboriginal filmmaker, as well. Okay, so Here I Am was her debut, and it follows a young woman who has been released from prison, and is trying to rebuild her life. And, as we saw last week, Cole has worked in documentaries and also on things like the documentary series The First Australians. So she brings this sense of realism, I think, to her work. Okay. We'll also see, examples of, films that show, differing experiences of Aboriginality. So in Beneath the Clouds by Ivan Sen, the young daughter is fairer skinned and, sort of ends up on a journey, that journey of young people that's fairly typical across different film genres. A film from the 1970s, which was highly acclaimed at the time, is called The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, which is based on the true events of a series of killings that occurred on a farm by an Aboriginal man called Jimmy Governor. And so this traces some of the tensions that are involved there. Another really award-winning film is Samson and Delilah by Warwick Thornton. And again, you can watch this in Canopy. So there really is a wide range that you can draw on. And I'd really encourage you to try to watch at least one film to get that full sense. So it would be useful even to revisit a film that you've seen before, but then watch it in light of trying to think critically about what are the representations of Aboriginality? What are the representations of country? You know, how have I changed since I first watched this film to watching it now? You know, so what sort of life experiences have I brought to the process as well?